Confederation was tremendously important because it created a strong federal government that had the right to create a criminal code, which criminalized certain social activities. And in 1892, one of those activities was in the realm of birth control and abortion. So the amendments to the 1892 Criminal Code made providing or procuring birth control or abortion illegal. It also meant that a new consumer culture in pills and potions that promised to quote-unquote return you to regularity emerged. And so women or men who were looking for some kind of birth control would often through mail order services order these pills and potions, which of course mostly didn't work, or well, they didn't work, but of course the consumer had no recourse because to complain would mean that you were admitting to a criminal act. Even when condoms that were effective, made out of vulcanized rubber, came on the market in the 1920s, those too were illegal and had to be distributed covertly. And of course, anybody who was desperate enough to end a pregnancy could turn to back alley abortions performed by practitioners who might or might not have had any medical training. As often was the case, those abortions had complications, so if there was excessive bleeding or an infection set in, women often waited too long to go and get medical help because the abortion had been illegal. And so we know about these illegal abortions often because of coroners who tried to get deathbed confessions from women who were dying of hemorrhaging or massive septicemia. So in that sense then, the federal power over the criminal code was dramatically important for the realm of sexuality. Unlike the United States, where those activists had to make a state-by-state campaign to get legislative change, in Canada, activists could really focus on the federal government. And this produced some of the most dramatic moments in even social activism in Canada, such as the 1970 abortion caravan. So a number of reproductive rights activists, feminists in Vancouver, got in their cars and their vans. They headed east, stopping in towns and cities along the way where they had demonstrations, they did street theater, they got lots of potlucks. They drummed up support for their campaign for legislative change, got to Ottawa where they were joined by other activists who'd heard about the abortion caravan. The activists chained themselves to the visitors gallery in Parliament Hill and pressured the federal government to provide better legislative framework for reproductive rights services in Canada.
Now, as we move to the First World War, and especially at the end of the First World War, there's a profound change that's underway. And we see the emergence now, especially as we move into the 1920s, of the modern girl, the flapper, who really bucked up against the profound constraints that were imposed upon women and had been, since 1867. In many ways, the modern girl was everything her grandmother was not. She cut her hair short, her clothing was much freer and looser, and more importantly, she was interested in engaging in some of the new forms of leisure and activities and consumer patterns that were emerging through the 1920s. The modern girl, especially among young middle-class women, challenged the conventional ideas about female sexuality and female sexual pleasure. And ultimately, the tension posed by the challenges of the modern girl played out over questions about access to contraceptions, access to women's capacity to control their own bodies. So this would play out directly over questions around sexual education, birth control, the availability of contraceptions. The criminal code directly regulated prostitution in Canada. And in doing so, we see a very clear articulation of a double standard. So for example, during the First World War, historians have identified a growing panic about venereal disease infection among the bodies of enlisted men. So this led to the introduction of the Venereal Disease Control Act in 1917. Now the interesting thing about the way that act was implemented was if a man, for example, was found tested positive for venereal disease infection, he was encouraged to identify the woman from whom by whom he was infected. She, in turn, was brought in, could be held for up to 1 week pending the outcome of the medical test results. If she tested positive, she in turn could be sentenced to an indeterminate sentence of up to 3 months and held in a facility, for example, the Andrew Mercer Reformatory for Females. Here in Toronto, we have lots of evidence of women who were incarcerated in that way. So the interesting thing is that the man was not held to account in this engagement, and of course we know that many elite men, middle-class men, working-class men readily engaged in this form of sexual commerce. But it was the woman who was found to be, or deemed to be, immoral and in need of correction.